Good afternoon, and welcome back to the Hidebound Convivium. It is November 10th, 2019, and today I'll be doing a short video discussing some thoughts in the range of educational theory, which, of course, as many of you may know, is my specialty, being a teacher by trade and being as that is what I do my undergraduate work in and what I'm planning to do after college. Specifically, what I want to talk about is a concept known as the trivium. It is a concept left over from medieval education, medieval programs of the university system, and it's something that I find to be very helpful in the range of talking about educational theories. I find it to be generally a good program of instruction or a good basis for a program of instruction. And much of my teaching philosophy has been to try to integrate the trivium into the required curriculum that the state requires its teachers to fulfill. So, like I said, this is going to be a short video, so we are going to go ahead and dive right into my my little presentation here. What I have up on the screen here is just a very simple dialogue of the trivium. Now, for a little bit of historical background, the trivium is really it has its basis in ancient Greece in the Academy at Athens, but it was sort of concretely formalized during the Carolingian Renaissance and during the birth of the medieval university system. And the three legs of the trivium, and the trivium just means three ways in Latin. The three legs of the trivium, in a sense, are logic, grammar, and rhetoric. And these are all three reinforcing concepts. So the logic, as I understand it here, logic is representations of the truth um, as expressed in formal argumentation. So in the diagram, it just says simply the truth, but a more accurate way to describe that would be the truth as expressed in the language of logic, if you will, in the language of formal argumentation. Grammar, as I understand it, then is the truth as is expressed in language. So you can look at something like St. Thomas's Five Ways. Those were originally written in Latin, but we have them translated into English. And the way that it's translated into English has a lot to do with the contingencies of English grammar, and that makes it important. Having specificity in grammar is important when dealing with logic and rhetoric. So grammar rather is truth as expressed in language. And rhetoric, the third leg of the trivium, is truth as represented and or manipulated. So St. Augustine talks a little bit about this in the Confessions. And he has a separate work where he talks a little bit about rhetoric as it is helpful to Christian apologetics. So um, in Augustine's understanding of rhetoric, of course, he taught rhetoric and was a student of rhetoric for a long time. And he compares rhetoric very much to the gold that the Israelites took from Egypt to melt down into um, articles of religious worship when they established their own or reestablished their own religion. So to Augustine, someone like Augustine, rhetoric is pagan gold that can be melted down and purified, if you will, into something that is suitable to Christian ends. And that's how he thinks of rhetoric. And I think this is spot on because, as this diagram sort of displays, rhetoric can be reflective of truth, or it can also be the truth manipulated. And so within the triangle, you see all these different concepts that are uh, related to the different aspects of the trivium and how they fit in. And the ideal age for when someone would begin studying these three branches is in they're say 13 to 15 because this is when this would have been done in the medieval university system. And what really in the medieval university system, what this did was this allowed students to have enough of a intellectual background to be able to read and understand texts that were germane to the quadrivium, which was arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and something else. I think medicine, but I'm not 100% sure. But there were four studies, and those together with the trivium constituted the liberal arts. Now, am I saying that every person that we need to forego our regular system of high school education, for example, in place of the trivium? Actually, that would probably be a good idea. But the reason I want to bring up the trivium more or less is that I think this is a good model for beginning to teach future right-wing leaders, because these are, future leaders in the traditional movement, because these are three skills that if you can understand these skills, you can basically, these are essential skills to understanding the cathedral, to understanding concepts that we talk about a lot within these circles, and to understand how to fight back against certain forms of control. So a lot of that actually goes along with rhetoric. So, the aspects of modern society that are meant to control us are very heavily influenced by rhetoric. And this is why I put things like political rhetoric and media tactics on the third leg there with rhetoric. Because in the modern day, to study rhetoric is to study the way that, for example, the mainstream media, people like this, will subvert language to a certain ends. This has always been sort of a study of rhetoric. During Augustine's day, what he was mostly talking about when he was talking about the evil of rhetoricians, of course, is sophists, and so we have our own sort of modern equivalent of what they were dealing with then in the form of sophistry. And so studying those sorts of things and taking those apart is key to understanding rhetoric in the modern world, and um, that of course requires one to be well versed in grammar and in logic. So grammar is something that a lot of hypothetically you're supposed to acquire understanding of grammar in elementary school, but more often than not, people actually don't acquire a good understanding of grammar ever, which is not necessarily the worst thing in the world. Not all people are called to this kind of work, but for those who are called to be these sorts of intellectual leaders, these are things that you absolutely must know. So you must acquire a language first of all. Second of all, I think it's very good. It's very good to learn code switching tactics. So, in the study of language, code switching refers to essentially changing the way one speaks in order to accommodate a certain audience or a certain setting. And so this is sort of a link in a sense between grammar and rhetoric. Now, a lot of people think of code switching as being deceitful. They think of, for example, politicians who affect, for example, an accent in order to appeal to country bumpkins, common folk, people like that. But it doesn't necessarily have to be like that. All code switching refers to essentially is to be able to tailor the way one speaks to the setting and to the message that you're trying to convey. And that is an important skill. Another important skill, I think, is etymology, to be able to understand where words come from, because in essence, this is a way to understand how words from different languages relate to one another, and the way that thought can transcend language barriers. So I think etymology is very important in that sense. And the intersection of grammar and logic, you might say, is conducting academic research, being able to comb through a document and be able to pick apart relevant factual information to be able to contribute to logically coherent argument. Which brings us, of course, to logic, which I think logic and a good understanding of logic, not only is it the thing that's most missing in our current system of education, but it's also probably the most important skill in terms of it is the closest to allowing people to apprehend certain universal truths. So, of course, a key skill in logic is argumentation, is understanding, how to build arguments, how to find problems in arguments, understanding what a premise is, how premise, certain conclusions have to follow from certain premises, and so on and so forth. This is the most glaringly obvious way in which these three skills are absent in our modern system of knowledge. I'll give you a great example. For those of you that know anything about the philosophy of religion, you'll know that the Epicurean argument from evil as a defeater for the existence of God is a terrible argument, and it's been a terrible argument for 3,000 years or so, or a little bit less than 3,000 years, and yet people will still post it. Post it around. For example, like at my school, there was an atheist group that posted the Epicurean argument on a bulletin board or something. And if people had a good grasp of logic, especially the laws of logic, because there not only is there lots of just bad arguments, like perfectly correct argument, formulated correct arguments, but they're bad. But there's also arguments that aren't formulated correctly. That's why the laws of logic are important to understand. The law of non-contradiction, which um, a lot of people have a hard time understanding these days. And then, of course, logical fallacies. There are two extremes of the spectrum. There are people who use logical fallacies and have no idea what they're doing. And then there are people who scream logical fallacy anytime something detrimental to their argument comes up, but they have no idea what an actual logical fallacy is. And then all of this together, all of these skills together, I think, meet in the practice of composition. Composition being the act of putting together a piece of writing that has intellectual heft, that is supposed to do something within the movement. So it has to be logical. The premises have to be true. The conclusions have to follow from the premises. It has to be grammatically correct. Not only does it have to be grammatically correct, I would say, but it has to evidence a kind of perfection in the grammar. So not only does it have to be grammatically correct, but it also has to be grammatically complex. It has to be interesting to the reader, and that goes into rhetoric. Also, it has to exhibit some sort of style, some sort of appeal that makes the writer want to listen. And also, you have to use tactics to convince people, because, like I said, as Augustine claimed, of course, that rhetoric is sort of a double-edged sword that can be used for good or for ill. And so the last thing I want to close out with, of course, so we've identified all three aspects of the trivium. We've identified the places where maybe they overlap a little bit, and now we want to talk about how to develop these things within our coalition, within our group of within our intellectual circles, and how we're going to cultivate these skills that are necessary for intellectual leaders on the right. Well, rhetoric, and this is something Augustine says as well, is that the way that you learn rhetoric primarily is by reading other people's stuff and by seeing what works in their style, by imitating them where they're doing something good, and by taking not taking aspects where they're doing something bad, where either they're being unconvincing or maybe they're telling the truth, but they're telling the truth in a very unconvincing way. And so rhetoric, you can compare it a lot to if you write fiction or you write creative creative works, you can think of it a lot as author's style. And the way, of course, if you've written fiction, the way that you develop a style as an author is that you take a little bit from all the different authors that inspire you, um, that you feel are good authors. You take what's good and you imitate that, and you put your own sort of twist on it. And I mean, this is how writers have been operating for generations. Of course, the whole idea that what's convincing and what's good rhetoric is something original is not the case whatsoever. Sometimes the oldest arguments, the oldest ways of doing things are the best ways of doing things. And of course, if you're on the right, you probably already know this. Now, the way to cultivate an understanding of logic, on the other hand, really it involves taking and picking apart arguments. And one of the key ways to do this is to, as they do in philosophy classes, to take an argument, to break it apart, to number all the premises, and look at it, in terms of mathematical relationships between premises and conclusions. So, A, A then B, B then not A. Whatever formulation um, the argument takes, you need to be able to have an understanding of how that functions in sort of a mathematical relation. Because logic, while it's contained within grammar, while there's elements of rhetoric in all of these philosophical treatises that you're going to read, logic, just pure logic, is in a sense, it can be reduced to these propositional statements, and that's the best way to understand logic qua logic, or logic at ground zero, what is being meant here. And then from that point you can build up to a stronger build up a more impressive tower. But of course you have to have that strong foundation of um, what you have there is the truth expressed in the simplest possible way. So that would be the aim, of course, of a training in logic. And then in grammar, the way that one comprehends grammar, I found, when I went through school, the way they tried to teach grammar was with worksheets, was with diagramming sentences, labeling parts of speech, and things like this. That can be helpful. It's helpful to some people, but really the best way to acquire skills in grammar, in a sense, is it's similar to rhetoric. Really, is that you have to be well read, and you have to be able to understand not only what the sentence says, but the functions of all the different parts in a sentence. And it's not important, I would argue, it's not important for someone to have a good education in grammar to be able to tell you what a participial phrase is. That's not important. And especially in a language like English that doesn't have case endings, it's almost as analytic as you can get. Um, in a language like English, um, grammar is much less rigid, much less formalized, and it's more just understanding the functions of things in a sentence. Because fundamentally, what grammar is it's relating things represented by symbols that we call words to other things in certain ways. And if you can understand how that works, then I would say that that goes a long way to understanding grammar. And just merely having declarative knowledge of what a participial phrase is or what a gerund is isn't helpful if you don't understand these word relationships. And that's sort of how it intersects with logic, of course. That, something like a premise disconnected from a conclusion, or disconnected from all the other premises that would form a conclusion, are useless. In the same way, words by themselves, without understanding the relationship between words, are useless in understanding grammar. So if you have any questions about this model of instruction that I've been talking about, if you have any questions about what sort of specifically this means, this has just been a basis for the philosophy that I've been working on, but it's by no means systematic or complete. These are just some things I think going forward we in the right wing, especially if we want to cultivate people who are intellectual leaders, who are people who can stand up to the systems of academia, the media, and those aspects of modernity that rule purely on rhetoric, purely on that one leg of the triangle. If we want to be able to stand up to those people, then we need to be well versed in all three of these fundamental skills, I think. But anyway, you may disagree with me. If you do, feel free to disagree in the comments section. And other than that, guys, this has been the Hidebound Convivium for November 10th. Have a good rest of the day and God bless.